What's up, guys? Zomboid Man here.
Nice.
Today we'll be experiencing Build 42 through the prism of insanely rare loot. So let's scroll over to the settings page and talk about it for a minute because my settings were a little more specific and revealing of how the Indie Stone has reworked the numbers behind the scenes. For this run, I actually set most settings to extremely rare, or also known as 0.2, and I'd say this felt to be about equivalent to the insanely rare loot setting in Build 41. But I did set canned food to insanely rare, or 0.05, and that virtually removed non-perishables from the game. Fuck! Which is actually quite a bit more rare than insanely rare in Build 41. And quite a brutal handicap for any playthrough in and of itself. This coupled with the rebalanced and improperly functioning nutrition system, and also the new and improperly functioning agriculture system, led to a perfect storm of food insecurity. I was always starving to death and in danger of becoming underweight. Literature was also in the extremely rare setting, and I found that books and magazines have been almost impossible to find. Almost every house loots like this, no food, although sometimes there's perishable food, only it doesn't sustain you, and almost no literature except for the entertainment variety. To make matters worse, I also upped the population, removed slow shamblers, and installed the Starving Zombies mod. For population, I set the multipliers to 1.5, 1.5, and 2. This combined with the Starving Zombies mod pretty much meant that wherever I killed any zombies at all would always become a hot zone of action, as new Zeds would constantly be called to the area, which would make my progress very slow. And with those rare loot settings, it would actually take quite a while to acquire enough decent weapons to be somewhat consistently efficient with combat. For the first few days, it was all rocks, shitty stabbing weapons, and stomping power. I did set guns to 1.0, or the normal loot setting, which meant they were somewhat obtainable, but not all that common. Because guns, and especially shotguns, were somewhat nerfed, and the new aiming system is somewhat goofy, they really were more trouble than they were worth until I got a few aim levels. But that's enough about the settings. For my build, I chose my usual firefighter with max strength and max fitness. As always, I consider this basic quality of life, especially the carry weight part of it. But even max strength, max fitness characters get fatigued very quickly. For negative traits, I took conspicuous because I actually want to be seen, and I also took prone to illness, weak stomach, slow reader, smoker, and high thirst. For the positives, I took only what I consider mandatory, which aside from athletic and strong, are the dexterous and wakeful traits, although wakeful seems to be nerfed almost into the ground. My character seems to need a full night's sleep, caffeine, and even a nap almost every day, which is quite a bit different than Build 41's wakeful. Also, I almost always give myself one free point so that I can take Speed Demon. I consider that trait to be lore specific, and it cannot be left out. Also, it has weird balance issues because it's only 1 point. Anyways, after randomly generating a man named George Tucker, we got started. Only I didn't start recording until the second day, but suffice it to say again, most of my time would be spent fighting zomboids in and around fences, with my feet, rocks, and any low-level pointy items that the Zeds happen to be carrying around inside of them. And I would kill zomboids in this fashion at a rate of about 100 a day. Anyways, picking up the playthrough from this first day of recording, the 10th of July and the second day of the apocalypse, That day was spent entirely lost in combat. For the 11th, I would continue the fight for territory in my local neighborhood, which was above the northern trailer park area of Muldrow. On that day, I was so starved for usable weapons, even rocks, that I resorted to using the pistol that you spawn with in order to pistol whip Zeds. Eventually, I would forge another rock, and I have to say that rocks are a fun weapon for a while, even if they got nerfed, and the few actual weapons that I would find would help me progress from stone to stone tools by leveling my maintenance, which is a satisfying boost once you hit level 1. But as you can probably imagine, this much combat requires a lot of resting. So I recommend 2 things to make this somewhat more enjoyable. The first is to set the Sandbox setting Endurance Regeneration to fast. This speeds up the resting phase of the gameplay loop. And next, I would recommend to download a mod like Resting Status Prompt, so you can actually know when your character has finished resting. Anyway, with the fatigue and weapon issues and the Z numbers, I wound up getting chased around the area all afternoon, and after finally breaking away from those Zeds, I had to take one of those naps I had mentioned before. Then I managed to get into a little trouble on the 12th when I decided to pick up a large branch and swung on a few Zeds with it. And even though I switched to a rock pretty quickly, the damage was already done. I would get very exhausted and be forced to flee, losing my goddamn hat in the process. But as I walked away, I would be given a lifeline when this police Zed showed up with a nightstick. Things were so brutal that this single nightstick would be a very big and very necessary power spike for my survival. After catching my breath for about half an hour, it was on. I would even start shouting to call in more of the fuckers. Like I said, the nightstick was a massive power spike. And this'll be the last time I mention it, I swear, but again, it was by noon that I was once again required to take another nap. Now, I don't know the full mechanics of it at this point, but I'm fairly sure your need to sleep is now more closely tied to your physical exertions. So the more physically you exert yourself, the sooner you need to sleep. Which in a way is another restriction to melee combat that wasn't quite as strong in Build 41. Anyway, after that it was back to farming Zeds, and I swapped out the bucket hat for George Tucker's signature bandana head wrap, and I hit level 1 short blunt pretty quickly after that. One thing to note about the Starving Zombies mod is that, yes, as the zomboids devour one another, the flesh is removed from the bodies of the ones devoured, but the loot is still there, or actually can be configured to be removed with the flesh too if you'd like. Anyway, the rest of that day was pretty much the same, more or less, but with a cleaver. And eventually I was able to loot a trailer or 2, but as you can tell, we're making progress at a snail's pace, and pretty soon that's gonna catch up with me. But before we move on, let's take a moment to appreciate the new lighting. I feel like I mention this in every one of my videos, but damn, what a vibe. Which is also why I might as well mention here that I took my own advice and changed the water and electricity shutoff times to the 0 to 2 months option, so I could enjoy this vibe for longer. Moment being over though, it was on the 13th, after plowing through about 500 zomboids, that I'd hit maintenance level 1. Which meant I was now able to craft stone tools, which then meant I was able to craft weapons pretty much at will, even if they were rather flimsy. But when loot is this rare and the zomboids are this plentiful, literally anything helps, like sifting through dumpsters. But honestly, with increased rarity loot settings, the dumpsters haven't been too productive. And the same would be true of this grocery store when I finally gained access to it. which would take about 2 hours of slapping Zeds with a cleaver. But at least I leveled up my axes, even if I still can't get used to a cleaver being categorized as an axe. The main score at the grocery store would probably be this bottle of mayonnaise and also a burrito. But I happened to get some seeds, which wouldn't be very useful because apparently agriculture is fairly broken at the moment, and this token can of beans would be like a drop in the ocean against my battle with starvation. After that, I went home and napped a stone on this imaginary bat that I didn't have and made my first stone axe. Then I took one of those naps I said I wouldn't mention again and got started on those crops that would never grow or succeed, even though I planted them during their sowing season. Then I put up some token window barricades which would never see any action. I killed some trees, marked up my map, and took my first bath. Not everything about the apocalypse is so bad after all. Now, despite everything, in about 5 days we had killed 440 Zeds. And by day 6, I thought my morning commute was looking pretty cool. But as much progress as all that represented, I still wasn't getting anywhere. That morning I would try spears and see that they still suck pretty bad. They were breaking even before killing a single Zed, and their broken shafts are also pretty bad at killing Zeds, for the record. Nevertheless, before my next obligatory midday nap, I would make some inroads into the next line of houses, spin like a top, and find this pizza cutter. At this point, though, I had already chewed through my nightstick, my cleaver, and my shitty crafted weapons. So I was back to slanging rock once again. And then I inspected this van, which looked like a survivor vehicle, but it wasn't. So I would remain a pedestrian for the time being. Now, back at home, the food situation was getting desperate. I had enough to tide me over for a couple days, but with how little was in the nearby homes and how empty the grocery store was, it was time to seriously get worried about becoming underweight. All there was to do, though, was to keep pushing. Potentially I could forage for food, but that would never maintain my weight. So the next day was more combat and little progress, but I happened to discover that planks seemed to make better weapons than they did formerly. And despite everything, I have to say that the neighborhood was at least somewhat getting whipped into shape. And not much else would happen for the next 2 days other than eating anything and everything I could get my hands off in a desperate attempt to stave off starvation. But I was already down to 76 pounds and hardly able to stem the tide of weight loss. It was inevitable at this point. And I would discover later that you can actually hit the underweight trait at 75, depending on your calorie status. So it's not actually necessary to fall all the way to 74, which meant that just after 7 days I was already on the brink of starvation. But we're gonna cut it here and release this as a part 1. We'll continue the insanely rare loot journey in a few days. Until then, peace.